So this book was my first ever Stephen King novel that I read that had sparked my love for Stephen King that you can see here. Fun story, this is also the first novel that Stephen King has ever written. Not the first published, but he started writing this when he was in high school. So the major movie picture, The Long Walk, just came out in theaters on September 12th. I went and watched it yesterday, and I definitely have thoughts. So grab a drink and let's get right into it. Hey y'all, welcome to or welcome back to my channel, Scotty Cherie Reads. And I'm so excited about this video. This is actually my first book to movie adaptation comparison. So I do want to say very quickly that the beginning of this is going to be spoiler free. And the later half will be spoiler filled, where I'll go into differences, things I liked that I didn't like. That was a difference from the book to the movie. So don't worry, you're totally okay in this section, and I will definitely give fair warning for when we do get into spoilers. So as I mentioned, first Stephen King novel that he wrote. Started it when he was in high school, finished it when he was in college, but this book was released in 1979. So it's an old book, but a pretty interesting concept that's gonna sound familiar to y'all, I think. So let me just get into the spoiler-free synopsis. The Long Walk follows a group of high school boys in a dystopian post-war America. For certain reasons, these boys decide to volunteer themselves for this competition called The Long Walk. And it is exactly what that sounds like. All of these boys line up in a starting point and they start walking. And the rules is that they have to stay at a certain pace. And if they get below that pace, they get 3 warnings. And after those 3 warnings, then they get what is called their ticket, which means that they are executed there on the spot by a firearm, and the kids just keep walking until there is one winner. And I guess the reason for why these boys do this is because at the end, you'll become so rich and have any wish that you want, anything that your heart desires, you will have. So that's the story. That's the entire story. Like I said, it sounds a little familiar because I think when people hear that synopsis, immediately they think of Hunger Games or Squid Games or, any other dystopian world that has this kind of competition for kids. And just saying, Stephen King did it first. I mean, this book came out in 1979. I'm sure that there were influence from him as well, but yeah, it kind of bothers me when this is coming out and people have seen the trailers and didn't know it was a Stephen King adaptation. And it's just like, oh, that seems like the Hunger Games or Squid Games. No, this one was first. So if it sounds interesting, definitely go out and support it. So let's get into just the spoiler-free review of how I felt about the book and the movie. I guess for starters, I want to say that I love this book. So this was the first Stephen King book that I've ever read, and I was captivated by it. The writing in here is fantastic, even though the story seems so simple, and the book is like decently long. I mean, it's almost close to 400 pages, and I was just so enthralled with the characters. And I mean, this is a good prototype or example of Stephen King's prototypes that you see in his other books, from the stereotypical characters in here, the relationships that they form, the intimacy that's there between the characters. It's a great place to start, I think, if you haven't read Stephen King. So that meant I was very, very excited to watch this movie. I reread this like a week ago in order to prepare for the film, and I was pleasantly surprised. I had high expectations for this. There are some differences, like major differences. Specifically, the ending is very different. I'm not going to say how in this section, but we'll get into how I feel about that. But let's get into a little, like, some fun facts about the movie itself. So Francis Lawrence is the director of this film, and funny enough, as I was saying, that the themes and tropes and even just basic plot for this story is very reminiscent of the Hunger Games, and Francis Lawrence actually directed all of the Hunger Games films except for the first one. So I think that this was a perfect director for this story, and I think that he executed this story very, very well. He also directed, I said Hunger Games, Water for Elephants, I Am Legend, Constantine, a lot under his belt. So knowing that and going into it, I was very excited to see him do another dystopian competition style movie. And I think that he did very well. The casting was done immaculately. The main two characters, who is Ray Garrity and Peter McVries, I think that's how you say it. They're the two main characters in this book. We do get to know a lot about the other boys who are in this walk, but those are the two main two that I'm going to talk about. Ray Garrity is played by Cooper Hoffman, who is the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman. So I was excited to see this. I haven't watched anything else that he's in. I'll put some titles here if he is in other movies, I'm not sure, but I think that he did a great job with this film. I'm eager to see what else he's going to come out with. And the star of the show for real was Peter McVries, who was played by, I want to say it's Danny Johnson. It's played by David Johnson, and this was my first time seeing his performance as well. Honestly, I don't watch a lot of the new movies that are coming out, but I heard that he's in Alien Romulus, which I haven't watched yet, but his acting was so incredible. I can't wait to see what else he comes out with, and I like the angle that they took for Peter, which made Peter a little bit more likable in the movie than he is in the book. But yeah, they hands down did such a great job. The dynamic between the actors just brought this story to life so much more, I think, than even in the book, for Ray and Peter specifically, because you were able to see everything that's going on screen. Makes it so much more emotional, and you're a lot more invested with these characters, I think, from looking at the portrayal on the screen. There are times that I cried in this movie, and I wasn't really expecting that. Even though it sounds really brutal, obviously, and there's a lot of death, I didn't cry in the book, I don't believe. So I wasn't really expecting to cry in the movie, but I was very surprised of how emotional I was with certain deaths. But just go into it with some tissues, because it is a heart-wrenching story. Another thing about the movie is that it is rated R, and they don't shy away from the violence at all. I think that that was so important. I'm so glad that they didn't take this book because it's a teenage age, like they're all under 18, and made it PG-13 and got rid of some of the horror, because that's what makes this book, and they did not shy away. So if you are not into, you know, blood, gore, things like that, this is not going to be for you. Another angle of this, aside from just seeing the kids get shot, which you do see point blank period. This isn't a spoiler because it happens before the title screen, but you get your first kill, or the first boy gets their ticket before the title screen even pops up, like before The Long Walk even pops up. So like in the book, it starts immediately with the start of the race, but the movie does the same thing, and I really appreciated that. But yeah, it's very gruesome. Another angle for this, aside from kids getting shot, as I was saying, is that when you think about walking, and these kids walk for days and days and days, there's no stop, you can't sleep. What does that look like? You know, if you have to use the restroom, what does that look like? And, you know, they don't shy away from those gory details on screen. So just be aware, but I love it. I think that the director did a great job to incorporate that stuff. I don't think it was overzealous in terms of gore and violence. It was necessary to evoke emotion and to prove the point that's there, but it wasn't overdone, in my opinion. I liked the banter between the teenage boys in the movie, and I think the actors did a good job of bringing that out from the book. A big part of it is the banter. And like, I mean, that's all that it is. It's really just the story of the characters and them forming relationships in their last moments, basically. And the things that teenage boys joke about, you know, from girls to mom jokes, it was all evoked very well on screen. There were times where I laughed, even in the midst of this gruesome story and journey. There were still some lighthearted, fun moments, and I think that the director did a great job to incorporate the things that were important and left out some of the, you know, overly sexual stuff that was in Stephen King's books, especially his earlier stories. Objectification of women, you know, some of the racist elements that are in there. Obviously, those things were taken out and molded into our more modern space where there's like a diverse cast, and I mean all shades of brown are you see in the actors that play these boys, and I really appreciated that. This movie comes in at about an hour and 40 to 45 minutes. And I think that that was perfect. I think it was a perfect amount of time for this story. This book, I didn't give it 5 stars specifically. I gave it about a 4 to 4.5 star. Love it still, but I didn't give it a 5-star read because I think that it could have been cut down a little bit. It gets a little monotonous, even though I think that it's the point. I think that some, like 50 pages or so, could have been cut out of the book, but I think that an hour and 40 minutes on screen was the perfect amount of time. I'm glad it wasn't 2 hours. It was great. He did everything that he needed to do within that time frame, and it didn't feel like I was looking at my clock to see when the movie was gonna be over. So overall, in the spoiler-free section, I want to say that I really enjoyed this movie. I think that this is one of the better Stephen King adaptations, even though the ending is very different from the ending in the book. But hold on to that. We'll talk about that in the spoiler section. In terms of, do I think you need to go out to theaters and watch it immediately? Not necessarily. Unless you're a fan like I am, I think it's worth it. I don't think you're wasting your money to go see it in theaters, but the way that it's shot and the story itself is just so character focused. There's not a lot of action that I think you necessarily need to see it on the big screen. However, with saying that, if you want more Stephen King adaptations that are done on this level, please go and support and spend your money. And, like that's the point. But if you're not a huge Stephen King fan and you just think that this sounds interesting, I think that you can wait until it comes onto a streaming platform. I don't think that the environment for the big screen is necessary for this very intimate movie. In terms of rating, I gave The Long Walk book a 4 to 4.5 stars. And for the movie adaptation, I'm giving it about a 3.5 to 4 stars. I need to sit on it a little bit. Like I said, I just watched it yesterday, but 3.5 to 4 stars. So definitely suggest it. Do you need to go out and see it immediately? I'm not saying that 100%, but it is worth a watch for sure. And of course, I'm always going to say, read the book. The book is almost always better and gives you more insight, and just to read the original text before going to see the movie. But that's just me, this is a book channel. So yeah, I think I still enjoyed the book more, which is almost always the case, but the movie adaptation I was pleasantly surprised with and enjoyed quite thoroughly. Okay, we are getting into spoilers. Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. So if you do not want to be spoiled for the book or the movie, it's time for you to log off now. So I'll give you a little bit. I'm gonna plug myself here that if you like what you saw so far, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. But let's get into the spoiler-filled section of this book to movie comparison. Okay. One more time, this is filled with spoilers, so bye if you don't want that. I have my phone here because I have a list of all the differences that I noticed between the book and the movie, and I feel like that's the best way to go about it, and I will give my thoughts with each difference that I saw, starting with small to eventually going to the ending, which is the biggest difference and I have the most feelings about. So for starters, the obvious one I think that you could see in either of the trailers was that in the movie, they cut it from 100 boys in this walk to 50. And I guess that makes sense. I don't feel any strong way about it. I think it has to do, obviously, with budget constraints. That makes sense. And it just makes sense to have like one kid per state, easy going. The next one's really funny because I noticed this in the trailer as well, and it goes from the pace being 4 miles per hour in the book to 3 miles per hour in the movie. And what's funny is that Stephen King is actually heavily involved in his movie making, or movie adaptations now because of previous bad experiences. And he himself did some math and realized that there was no way anyone was gonna be able to do the walk as long as they did at 4 miles per hour. So he just changed it to 3. I also think continuity wise, 3 warnings, 3 miles per hour, it just flows a little better. So I thought that was funny because Stephen King himself was like, yeah, I didn't really check that when I wrote it when I was in high school, but yeah, we should definitely push it down to 3 miles per hour. The next difference is the lack of crowds watching the walk. So in the book, the crowds and spectators that are in Maine who are watching this walk plays a big part, and I missed that in the movie. In the movie, there's no crowd until the absolute very end where there are only two people left. And I understand because it's probably just budget constraints, so you don't have hundreds and hundreds of extras that you have to pay. But I did miss that from the book. I think the interactions of having, kids like being spectators of this gruesome act, just speaks to society as a whole and has a whole deep layer of, what our society is capable of that was left out in the movie. Not the biggest concern, but was a difference, and I do miss that from the book a bit. All right, some people may think I'm stretching with this one, but I really don't think so. I think the movie focused on there being a queer gay relationship between Ray and Peter and like gay attractiveness, at least from Peter's side of things. But I think that there were some suggestions about that towards the end and the love that they've had for each other that I think went a little beyond brotherly love. In the book, Peter has a girlfriend, and it's a pretty gruesome story because she's the one who basically gave him the scar on his face. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And Ray also had a girlfriend that was there at the end of the walk, like with his mother. And she kind of ended up being kind of his motivation for finishing this walk. But they did say that he had a girlfriend beforehand in the movie, but they basically broke up because he felt that that was important to do because he was going on this walk and might not return home, and he didn't want her to like go through that. So they got the girlfriends out of the way. But what was funny is that there was a part in there where Ray asked Peter, like, do you have a girlfriend at home? And he's like, no, I don't have a girlfriend. Wink, wink, like, I don't like girls type of situation. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. There was a big, obvious, like, rainbow scene that happened. And obviously, the ending, there was a lot of love that was there. So, I mean, you can view it however you want, but I feel like I picked up on it a little bit in the book. But when the movie came out and I saw those things, I was like, oh, I wasn't tripping or just hoping that was the case. There is some subtle stuff there. And like I said, Stephen King is a major person who has a say with things that go into it, from casting to the ending to everything about the movies. So I thought that was interesting because that was a bit of a difference, but I did enjoy that. All right, let's go back to the difference between Ray and the fact that Ray didn't have his girlfriend, Jan. He talks about Jan in the book a lot. And like I said, at the end of the race, basically he's trying to get to the point. He almost gives up a couple of times, and Peter helps him multiple times to get him to his hometown in Maine, just to be able to like see his mom and to see his girlfriend potentially, one last time. And I kind of liked they got rid of the girlfriend because it made the focus more on the mother and the connectiveness between the mother and son bond and what that love is like, and how much he would miss his mom, and how much his mom would feel for him if he is murdered, from this walk. And I think in the book it's kind of funny because at the end he kind of goes over and gives them hugs and stuff, but it seemed like he focused so much more on his girlfriend, which is like high school love, over his mother, which was kind of funny, I thought, in the book. But I like that they took the girlfriend out and focused on the bond between the mom, which we'll get even deeper into how they made the bond between his mother even stronger from Ray's backstory, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So in terms of the other boys, part of the Musketeers, I think that those characters are done really well. However, what is his name? Scram? Let me look and make sure. Yeah, Scram, who is like the country boy, who is the one in the book who has the pregnant wife at home, and he's the only one out of the 100 boys who has a wife and she's pregnant, and the boys can't really understand like why he's sacrificing all of this when he has a family at home. And they explain that he's the one who people are kind of rooting on to win this walk because he seems like he's the most physically fit, and he talks about how he just loves to walk and he just goes out and does these super insane long walks, and he just seems like nothing's fazing him. They do say he's a little bit slow mentally, and we get to know him a bit throughout the book, and ultimately he just gets a cold, which turns to pneumonia, and that is his demise. So Scram is not in the movie, but what they did is they took characteristics and put them to other boys. So Scram's not there in the movie, but they give the wife to Olsen, Hank Olsen, and they doesn't say if she's pregnant or not, but he ends up being the boy who has the wife at home. And then in terms of the strength and the projection that he could win, and looks like he is the number one prospect, I guess, for who would win, goes to Stebbins. So it goes to Stebbins, and Stebbins is the one who ultimately has the cold and then gets pneumonia and ultimately dies. So yeah, Scram's not there. They move those two characteristics to other characters, and I thought that was fine. I mean, I was excited to see Scram a little bit, but I understand, like, qualities are still there. The emotion is still there with the other characters, so I think it was okay, not that big of a deal. So let's talk about Stebbins now. So Stebbins in the book is the one who kind of stays behind and makes his pace stay at like 4 miles per hour. He doesn't really talk to people very much. He's kind of elusive. And eventually, once Scram dies, who was the main person they thought that was going to win the biggest competition, Stebbins ends up being that next person because he doesn't seem like much is phasing him. And the big reveal is that he's actually the Major's bastard son. And, you know, he's doing this to prove a point and to hopefully win and kind of, you know, be in his father's house and family, you know, and to kind of stick it to him. In the movie, because they took some of Scram's strength, the way that they casted Stebbins was like not at all how I imagined it in the book. I understand why they did it that way, and it leads to the overarching story in the movie of it being a little bit more political, I would say, because we get a bit more backstory as to the hate for the Major and the hate for the walk and like why the walk is so unfair. But I was a little bit disappointed because it took me a second to realize who Stebbins was. The reveal of him being the Major's son, I clocked that at the beginning, and I don't know if that's because I've read the book. So someone who hasn't read the book, at the beginning when the Major was calling out the names, he said, you know, here you go, son, when he was giving him the tag. And in the movie, they really focused on the fact that Stebbins was the only one that he said son to. And at the beginning, I was like, what the hell? Like, why'd they ruin that surprise so early on? And my husband came with me who hasn't read the book, and I asked him, and he was like, I mean, I kind of noticed it, but I didn't really think much of it. So someone who hasn't read the book, was that a spoiler? Like, did you know, or were you just as shocked at the end when you found out that Stebbins was the Major's son? I'm really curious. All right, diving into the Major's character a bit in the movie. So the Major plays a way bigger role in the movie than in the book. And there's so much hate for the Major. I didn't really buy it because I feel like they made it seem like all of this was just solely the Major's fault for the walk and he was the sheer only villain. When I think that, you know, spoiler alert, he dies at the end, it didn't move me at all because it's not just one guy. It's a structure from the government that's allowing this to happen. So just killing one guy, I don't think is going to change anything. But anyway, I don't know. I think that the play of the Major was a little corny, I think, in the movie. I kind of like the elusiveness and just not really understanding the Major, and we don't get to see him very much in the book. I think I prefer that because I think it just made it so much more like Hollywood with this super villain that the Major became. The Major is also a major villain because they changed Ray Garrity's dad's backstory. So in the book, Ray doesn't grow up with his dad, or his dad is removed violently by the squads from his house. I mean, you kind of assume that he died, and it had to do with kind of anti-government like agenda, but we don't get very much about it. But in the movie, that is the main focus as to why Ray chose to be a participant in the Long Walk, because his dad would take these anti-government books in order to teach Ray, and eventually he was found out, and the Major himself came to their house, drug Garrity's dad out of the home and shot him point blank period in front of Ray and the mother. So the whole point in the movie is that Ray is starting out this walk to avenge his father's death, and he's saying that his ultimate wish at the end is that he's going to ask for a carbine, like from, like kind of as a souvenir, you know, and he is going to shoot the major point blank period in order to get revenge for his father's death. As the story progresses and he is talking to Peter, he kind of starts to understand that, you know, revenge isn't always the best situation. And towards the end, when he finally sees his mom, you know, he has this breakthrough revelation that he was so wrong for joining this walk because he's never going to win. And he is about to hurt his mom in the worst way possible, that she's going to see him be murdered just like the father. So the major wins twice. The government continues to win. And I understand it, and I think that that leads to good talking points, especially in the way of our world right now, but it did feel a little cheesy to me. And then now getting into the ending, let's talk about why I didn't like the ending and why I felt like it was cheesy and kind of a little lackluster compared to the ambiguous ending in the book. All right, so let's start with the ending of the book, just to give a refresher if you haven't read it or you just forgot. So at the end of the book, Stebbins and Ray Garrity are the final two, which is different from the movie. We'll get into that in a second. Peter, who has been Ray's kind of good buddy this whole time, he just, you know, sits like he said when he just got tired and he just kind of gave up and he's killed. Then it's Stebbins and Garrity left. And basically Stebbins just gets so exhausted that he just, you know, he's just so exhausted that he just kind of starts to die, you know. And I'm gonna read the last few paragraphs here because I want to discuss the open-ended ending of the book here. So it says, behind him, they finished by shooting the already dead Stebbins, and now there was only him, alone on the road, walking toward where the Major's Jeep had stopped diagonally across the white line, and the Major was getting out, coming to him, his face kind and unreadable behind the mirrored sunglasses. Garrity stepped aside. He was not alone. The dark figure was back up ahead, not far, beckoning. He knew that figure. If he could get a little closer, he could make out the features. Which one hadn't he walked down? Was it Barkovich, Collie Parker, Percy what's-his-name? Who was it? Garrity! The crowd screamed deliriously. Garrity! 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 Was it Scram? Gribble? Davidson? A hand on his shoulder. Garrity shook it off impatiently. The dark figure beckoned in the rain. Beckoned for him to come and walk, to come and play the game. And it was time to get started. There was still so far to walk. Eyes blind, supplicating hands held out before him as if for alms, Garrity walked toward the dark figure. And when the hand touched his shoulder again, he somehow found the strength to run. So you can interpret that as Garrity died. You know, he died from exhaustion as well. He lost his mind and he's never going to be the same. From my perspective, I think the point that Stephen King was trying to say is that, you know, it's not, the long walk's not worth it. Whether he's completely lost his brain, it's kind of how I feel, is that I don't think that he died necessarily, but his mental capacity, it just snapped. His mental brain just snapped, and it's never going to be the same because of all of the gore and what he just went through. So it's just not worth it. And I liked the open-endedness, and it wasn't so simplistic, and I just like to be able to discuss the ending of The Long Walk with other people. I like when books leaves it open to interpretation, to hear other people's opinions. So speaking of that, from the book, let me know down below if you agree with my interpretation or if you have a totally different understanding, because that's the fun of it. So instead of at the end it being Stebbins and Garrity who were the final two, it's actually Peter McVries and Garrity. So Stebbins, in the movie when I'm watching it and Stebbins dies first, I was locked in and was like, oh shit, what's about to happen? Because this is already very different. So basically at the end, Ray makes it and he sees his mother. And in that moment, as I talked about, he understands he made the biggest mistake he could have done, because no one ever really wins. The government's always going to win. And more than likely, his mother is going to see him executed at the hands of the Major yet again, and he kind of starts to lose it. They keep walking together, they're holding each other up, and Peter just starts to give out. And Peter stops and he tries to say, Ray, you need it for your mom, don't let your mom see you die in this way. And Ray comes back and he helps Peter up. And he's like, no, we got to keep going. And, this is a significant moment because Peter throughout this whole time has helped Ray so many times. We'll get into that a little bit later, but this was Ray's time to come and help Peter. He gives Peter up, but in the midst of all of this, they both stop. So both of them have had, 2-3 warnings. And once Ray gets Peter off the ground, Ray decides to sacrifice himself in order to let Peter live. So Ray gets Peter up, he tells him to keep walking, and then Ray stops walking and he doesn't have any other warnings, and he's shot right there in front of Peter by the Major, which was a difference as well, because the Major doesn't shoot anyone in the first book, but in the movie, they make him this big villain that he is the one who executes the last boy before they have the winner. So yeah, there's a really emotional scene between, Ray's death and Peter, and ultimately Peter's there for a while, and the Major comes up and, they're celebrating like, you've won. What is your wish? And in that moment, Peter wishes to have the gun, the carbine, and he kills the Major in order to avenge Ray. And then he turns around, everything kind of goes quiet, and it shows the road and no crowd, and he just kind of starts walking down the road, and that's the end of the movie. So, very different. I guess it could be a little ambiguous at the end. I assume that he just died, because realistically there's no way he murdered the Major right there and he wasn't murdered himself. So that's my opinion, but I've seen other videos and it seems like other people took it a little bit differently. But from my perspective, in that moment, he loved Ray so much that he went against everything that he spoke about in the movie, killed the Major, and then was immediately killed himself, and it was all just kind of a fucking waste, honestly. But let me know what you thought happened at the end. But I see why Hollywood chose to have the art go this way, because I think it is very applicable to what's going on in our country right now, where the rich keeps getting richer and the poor just keeps getting poorer. And you see these parallels and these dystopians that don't seem super far off. And it leaves the question of, Peter's decision at the end, because Peter in this story is the one who has come from a shitty background, but is also the most hopeful in this story. And that's a little bit different in the book. So maybe, okay, let's go to the next topic. So let's talk about leaving your opinions down below about how you thought the ending from the book versus the movie differed, what your interpretation was and which one you liked better. But let's get into Peter as a character, because I have a lot of thoughts on him specifically. Peter. I love Peter, and Peter is going to be everyone's favorite in the movie. However, I never felt that connected to Peter in the book very much at all. It is pretty wild because Peter in the book is a lot more crass. Like, he cusses a lot, he says really abrasive things, and he's not like super likable in the book. So it was interesting to see the huge change in role for him for the movie. I want to talk about his backstory. So let's talk about the scar on his face a little bit more in depth that I had mentioned earlier. So in the book, he gets a scar from his girlfriend, kind of girlfriend at the time. He doesn't really have a girlfriend during the walk. It's kind of complicated. But Stephen King basically hints at the fact that Peter basically tried to sexually assault his girlfriend, and he advanced on her to like kiss her, and she had a letter opener and like protected herself and cut him, and that's why he has that big scar. Some people are gonna battle that in terms of what's written on page and what's not. But in my opinion, I think in the book, because Peter's telling it from his perspective, he was trying to sexually assault her. Even if that's not what he thought in his brain, that's what the reality of it was, because he was kind of a shitbag in the book. But I digress. Totally not the case in the movie. So in the movie, he's basically an orphan, and he is just raised in a really rough environment, and he's picking fights with people, and he basically picked a fight with the wrong one, and someone had a knife and got him good, and he survived. And after that moment, he realized that he's at the bottom, but the only way to go is up and to be hopeful. And so throughout this walk, he is the one who's kind of like live in the moment. Nothing else matters. We just go from moment to moment to moment. And it's important for us to have these relationships here and to not hate each other, because what else do we have? We're in this together. We need these little moments. Who else is going to understand us more than the people who are facing their demise like we are? And he becomes this almost angelic figure. However, this is really funny, because when I saw the casting and when the movie started, prickles started to happen in not a good way, because Peter is black in this film and Ray is white. And I know that throughout this story, Peter constantly helps Ray. Like, Ray would not have made it to the end if it wasn't for Peter in the book. So when I saw this, and the way that Peter wasn't this snarky character, and instead he was very loving and wise and optimistic, I was like, are we going down the spiritual black character route? Which I'm not a fan of. So as much as I didn't ultimately like the ending, I prefer the ending for the book. I do like the flip, because if it would have happened the way that it did in the book, and Peter would have died, the black character would have died, who had been saving Ray this whole time, and Ray would have won, I would have hated this movie, and it would have been rage. I would have had a rage-filled review, but that's not the case. So I did like that they changed it for that reason, and that was a shock at the end. So that's why I say I need to sit here for a little bit longer in order to know if it's 3.5 or 4 stars, because I thought that I was gonna really hate it, and I was pleasantly surprised that Peter is the one who lived and it wasn't the black guy who died, basically. The last thing is that at the end, because they had Peter be this optimistic person, and he ended up winning, which was great. And the fact that he went backwards and sacrificed everything for Ray was hard to grapple with. I think that you can interpret it, and not so much in a negative way, and think of it in terms of love can spark change. I think that's the way that you can kind of look at this ending, in the sense that Peter loved Ray so much that he sacrificed, himself, his winnings, all the stuff from killing the Major. But remember, this is televised for the nation to see. And I guess in order to have a little bit of hope with the movie ending is that maybe that will spark change, from him murdering the Major, who is the villain, on screen, and doing it because of his love for Garrity, can kind of be a larger conversation of how love can evoke large change. Even though Peter's not going to be there, because in my brain he passed away, but it can still spark a movement that can lead to large change, if that makes sense. So that's it, y'all. If you have noticed any other differences that I missed, please leave them down below. I love being able to pick apart the book and the movie, but overall, I think this was a great adaptation. I like the ending of the book better, but I also see why they changed the movie, so I'm not necessarily mad at it. I like them both, just I like the book a little bit better. If you've watched the movie, read the book, leave your comment down below as to how you felt about it. Other than that, if you like what you saw here, please subscribe. It helps me out. And until the next video, I'll chat with y'all in the comments. Thanks for being here. Bye.